When a homeless child screamed, "Don't eat that," Big Shaq stepped in and no one expected. The streets of Manhattan were alive with festive energy on a cold December evening. Amid the holiday lights and bustling crowds, a towering figure stood out, Shaquille O'Neal, bundled in a thick coat, blending in as much as a 7-foot-tall NBA legend could. He was enjoying the anonymity, quietly savoring the city's magic, when a desperate cry shattered the evening air. "Don't eat that!" Shaq froze mid-bite, his massive hand holding a freshly purchased hot dog. He turned toward the voice, his brow furrowing as he spotted a young boy no older than 9. The boy's tattered hoodie and dirt-smudged face spoke of hardship, but it was his frantic eyes that held Shaq's attention. "What's wrong?" Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but concerned. The boy hesitated before blurting out, "It's poisoned." A hush fell over the bustling street. Shaq crouched down, his large frame making him seem even more protective as he faced the boy. "What do you mean, poisoned?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The boy's small hands trembled as he pointed at the hot dog. "I saw someone give the vendor money and tell him to poison it," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear I'm not lying." Shaq studied the boy carefully. His oversized hoodie hung off his shoulders, and his sneakers were worn down to the soles. Despite the child's ragged appearance, his desperation was unmistakable. "What's your name, little man?" Shaq asked gently. "Tyler," the boy whispered, glancing around nervously. Shaq stood, his broad shoulders towering over the vendor. "Hey, is this true?" he asked. The vendor stammered, his face pale. Tyler tugged at Shaq's sleeve. "Please," he pleaded. "You have to believe me. The vendor's secret?" The vendor's hands trembled as Shaq's imposing figure loomed over him. "Man, I don't know what this kid is talking about," the vendor stammered, wiping his brow. "My food's clean. Always is." Shaq's sharp eyes studied him. "Then why are you sweating like you just ran a marathon?" he asked, his voice calm but intimidating. Tyler tugged on Shaq's sleeve again, his voice urgent. "I saw a man earlier. He gave him cash. He said it was for someone important, and then he walked away." The vendor's face flushed. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just sell food here." Shaq handed the hot dog back to the vendor. "Keep it," he said, pulling out $100 bill. But Tyler shook his head in Tyler's hand. "It's not about the money. Go get something safe. It's about trust." Shaq led Tyler down the street, the boy gripping his hand tightly. Despite the festive lights and laughter around them, Tyler's face remained pale, his eyes darting nervously. A small diner caught Shaq's attention. "Let's get inside, warm up and talk," he said, guiding Tyler through the door. The warmth of the diner wrapped around them as they settled into a booth near the window. The waitress brought 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. Tyler hesitated before taking a cautious sip, his small hands gripping the cup like it was his lifeline. Shaq watched him carefully. "All right, little man," he said gently. "Tell me what's going on. Why do you think someone poisoned that hot dog?" Tyler's voice was barely above a whisper as he explained what he'd seen. A shadowy man handing the vendor cash and muttering something about sending a message. Shaq's jaw tightened. "You did the right thing telling me." The bell above the diner door jingled, breaking the momentary calm. Tyler froze mid-sip, his eyes widening in terror as a tall man in a black coat entered. His gaze swept the room before locking onto their booth. "That's him," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. "The man I saw talking to the vendor." Shaq turned his head subtly, his body language protective as he shifted slightly in front of Tyler. The man's sharp features and piercing eyes were impossible to ignore. He smirked when he spotted Shaq's towering frame but didn't back down. The man walked to the counter and ordered a coffee, his movements calm, calculated. But Tyler couldn't stop staring, his grip on Shaq's arm tightening. "It's okay," Shaq said in a low voice, his eyes still on the stranger. "I've got you." The man turned, coffee in hand, and began walking toward their booth. The man in the black coat stopped a few feet from their booth, his smirk cold and unsettling. "Didn't expect to find you here, Shaq," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. Shaq straightened, his broad shoulders blocking Tyler from view. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone firm but calm. The man's eyes flicked toward Tyler for a brief moment before returning to Shaq. "Not the kid," he said with a chilling smile. You've got something we need." Shaq frowned, his mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice steady. The man chuckled. "Oh, I think you do, but don't worry, we can discuss it another time. Just know this isn't over." As he turned to leave, Tyler whispered, "He's lying. He's the one behind it all." Shaq tightened his jaw. We'll handle this. Together. As soon as the man exited the diner, Shaq leaned across the table. We need to get you somewhere safe, Tyler. Do you trust me? Tyler nodded, his small frame trembling. I don't have anyone else, he admitted. Shaq paid the bill and guided Tyler out of the diner, his sharp eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. The festive lights seemed dimmer now, the holiday cheer replaced by a gnawing tension. He pulled out his phone and dialed a trusted friend. Sandra, it's Shaq. I've got a situation, and I need your help. Sandra Bullock's warm voice responded. Anything you need. Bring him here. A short cab ride later, they arrived at Sandra's brownstone. She opened the door, her face a mix of concern and curiosity as she ushered them inside. You're safe now, Shaq reassured Tyler. No one will hurt you here. Inside Sandra's cozy brownstone, the tension in Tyler's shoulders eased slightly. Sandra handed him a warm blanket and hot cocoa, her motherly instincts immediately kicking in. Shaq explained the situation, recounting Tyler's warnings, the poisoned hot dog, and the unsettling encounter at the diner. Sandra listened intently, her expression growing serious. This isn't random, she said firmly. That man knew who you were, Shaq. And Tyler. They're after him for a reason. Tyler clutched the blanket tightly, his voice barely a whisper. It's because of my parents. They used to talk about people watching us. Then they disappeared. Sandra's eyes softened as she knelt beside him. Do you know what they were involved in, Tyler? Tyler shook his head, tears welling up. Just something important. I don't know what. Shaq exchanged a look with Sandra. We need answers, he said, and we need to keep him safe while we find them. Tyler sat cross-legged on the couch, his small fingers nervously playing with the edges of the blanket. Shaq knelt in front of him, his gentle voice breaking the silence. Tyler, anything you remember about your parents could help us. It doesn't have to make sense, just tell us what you can. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting to Sandra for reassurance. They used to argue about keeping something hidden, he began. My mom said it was too dangerous, and my dad said it could change everything. Shaq frowned. Did they ever say what it was? Tyler shook his head. No, but my mom always said, they'll come for it if they find out. Sandra exchanged a worried glance with Shaq. Whatever it was, it's put him in their crosshairs now. Shaq nodded, his resolve hardening. We need to figure out what they were protecting. Fast. Shaq pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Lawrence, I need your help. It's urgent. Within an hour, Shaq, Tyler, and Sandra were in an unmarked SUV, guided by Lawrence Fishburne. The streets of Manhattan faded behind them as they drove toward a remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. This place is off the grid, Lawrence explained. No one will find us here while we figure out our next move. Tyler stared out the window, his small hand clutching the seatbelt tightly. Why are you helping me? He asked softly, his voice filled with both curiosity and doubt. Shaq glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Because no kid should have to fight this alone, he said firmly. When they arrived, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, quiet, surrounded by towering trees. But even as the group settled in, Shaq's instincts told him the danger wasn't far behind. The cabin was modest but cozy, with a crackling fireplace and sturdy wooden furniture. Tyler explored cautiously, his small footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Sandra set up a makeshift bed for him in the corner, while Shaq and Lawrence double-checked the locks and windows. You think they'll find us out here? Sandra asked, her voice low. They always do, Shaq replied grimly, his eyes scanning the dark forest beyond the window. But this gives us time to plan. Tyler sat near the fire, his knees drawn to his chest. I've never stayed anywhere this nice, he admitted, his voice almost too soft to hear. Shaq crouched beside him, his massive hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. You're safe here, little man. We're not going to let anything happen to you. But as the flames danced in the fireplace, shadows outside the cabin seemed to grow longer. The forest around the cabin was eerily silent. Shaq stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. Something didn't feel right, a tension in the air that made his instincts buzz. Shaq, you've been staring out there for an hour, Sandra said, placing a hand on his arm. I don't like this, he muttered. It's too quiet. Lawrence joined them, holding a flashlight. Let's take a quick look around the perimeter. If anyone's out there, we'll know. Outside, the cold night bit at their skin as they carefully circled the cabin. Snow crunched under their boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Shaq paused, his breath visible in the freezing air. "There," he whispered, pointing to a set of faint footprints leading into the trees. Lawrence's grip on the flashlight tightened. "We're not alone." Inside, Tyler peeked through the window, his heart pounding. A rustling sound broke the stillness of the forest. Shaq and Lawrence exchanged a tense look as they followed the footprints deeper into the trees. Suddenly, a shadow darted between the trunks, too fast to track. "Did you see that?" Lawrence asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Shaq replied, his deep voice steady. "We need to get back to the cabin. Now." As they turned, a loud crash came from the direction of the cabin, followed by Sandra's panicked scream. Shaq broke into a sprint, his massive strides pounding against the snow-covered ground. Inside, Tyler was huddled under the table as masked intruders smashed through the door. Sandra stood protectively in front of him, wielding a fire poker. Shaq burst in like a force of nature, his imposing presence stopping the intruders in their tracks. "You messed with the wrong house," he growled, stepping forward, ready to defend. The fight was swift and decisive. Shaq's sheer size and strength overwhelmed the intruders, who scrambled to retreat when Lawrence appeared with backup. Within minutes, the cabin was secured again, but the tension in the air remained thick. Shaq turned to one of the captured intruders, his voice calm but menacing. "Who sent you? What do you want with the kid?" The man smirked but said nothing. Lawrence stepped forward, shaking his head. "We're not getting answers from him tonight. Let's focus on what we already know." As Sandra comforted a shaken Tyler, Shaq and Lawrence searched the intruder's belongings. Among the items was a folded piece of paper with coordinates scribbled on it and a photograph of Tyler's parents. Tyler's voice trembled as he asked, "Why do they have that? What do they want from me?" Shaq crouched beside him. "We're going to find out, and we're going to stop them. You're not alone." As dawn broke over the forest, the group gathered around the small wooden table in the cabin. Shaq spread out the items they'd taken from the intruders: the coordinates, the photograph of Tyler's parents, and a map marked with strange symbols. "What do these coordinates lead to?" Sandra asked, leaning closer. Lawrence frowned, studying the map. "They point to an industrial complex just outside the city. This might be where they're operating from." Shaq looked at Tyler, whose eyes were fixed on the photo of his parents. "Does any of this seem familiar to you?" he asked gently. Tyler hesitated, then nodded. "My dad used to talk about a place like that. Said it was where everything started." Shaq straightened, his determination clear. "Then that's where we're going." Sandra's brow furrowed. "You can't just walk in there, Shaq. It's too dangerous." "We'll plan," he replied, his voice firm. "But I'm not letting them win." The group spent hours strategizing their next move. Lawrence made calls to trusted contacts, Sandra prepared supplies, and Shaq kept Tyler close, reassuring him with quiet words of encouragement. But as the afternoon wore on, an uneasy tension settled over the cabin. One of Lawrence's contacts, a man named Darryl, arrived with information about the industrial complex. "It's heavily guarded," he warned. "You'll need a distraction to get in." Shaq nodded, trusting Lawrence's network. But Tyler stayed quiet, watching Darryl with wary eyes. "I don't like him," he whispered to Shaq when they were alone. "Why?" Shaq asked. Tyler shrugged. "I just don't." That night, Shaq's instincts kicked in when Darryl made a suspicious call outside the cabin. As Shaq stepped outside, he overheard him saying, "They're all here. You'll have your chance tonight." Shaq's blood ran cold. They had been betrayed. Shaq burst back into the cabin, his voice urgent. "We've been set up. They're coming." Lawrence's jaw tightened, and Sandra quickly gathered their essentials. Tyler clung to Shaq's arm, his wide eyes filled with panic. "What do we do?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "We run," Shaq said firmly, "and we don't stop until we're safe." As they fled into the dark forest, the sound of engines and footsteps grew closer. Flashlights pierced through the trees, their pursuers closing in. Shaq carried Tyler, his massive strides swift despite the uneven terrain. Shots rang out behind them, splintering tree trunks and sending birds scattering into the night. Lawrence led the way, guiding them toward a hidden trail he had scouted earlier. "Keep moving," Shaq shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. As the group reached a clearing, The roar of a helicopter filled the air. Their enemies weren't giving up easily. The helicopter's spotlight swept over the clearing, forcing the group to scatter for cover. Shaq crouched low, shielding Tyler behind a fallen tree. The boy clung to him, trembling. "Stay down, no matter what happens," Shaq whispered, his deep voice calm despite the chaos around them. Lawrence motioned from a nearby cluster of trees. "There's a cave up ahead," he called out. "We can make a stand there." Before they could move, masked men emerged from the forest, cutting off their path. Shaq stood to his full height, his broad shoulders and towering frame a wall of protection. "You want the kid? You'll have to go through me," Shaq growled, stepping forward. The men hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of his sheer size and determination. But when one lunged at him, Shaq acted with precision, taking down attackers with powerful blows. Behind him, Lawrence and Sandra covered Tyler, moving him toward safety. "We're almost there!" Lawrence shouted. Shaq glanced back, ensuring Tyler was secure, then braced himself as more enemies advanced. The roar of the helicopter faded as Shaq delivered the final blow to the last attacker, his immense strength leaving their enemies incapacitated. Tyler watched from the cave entrance, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and awe. Lawrence stepped forward, a phone to his ear. "The authorities are on their way," he said, his voice steady but tired. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the forest as law enforcement arrived. The masked men were taken into custody, their operation dismantled. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran, approached Shaq. "You did more than we could have imagined," he said, shaking Shaq's hand. "This group's been on our radar for years. You just handed us the break we needed." Shaq nodded, his focus shifting to Tyler. "What happens to him now?" The officer hesitated before replying. "That's up to you." Shaq crouched beside Tyler, his voice gentle. "You're safe now, big guy. But this isn't the end. We'll figure out what's next together." For the first time, Tyler smiled. The morning sun broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over the cabin and the clearing, now quiet. Tyler sat on the porch, bundled in one of Sandra's blankets, watching as Shaq and Lawrence spoke with the officers. Sandra joined him, handing over a mug of cocoa. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better," Tyler said softly, his eyes on Shaq. "I've never had anyone fight for me like that." Shaq approached, his towering frame casting a long shadow. He knelt beside Tyler, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the end, little man. We're going to make sure you're safe for good. You'll have a home, people who care about you." Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "Will you still be there?" Shaq smiled, resting a massive hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Always. You're family now." As they left the cabin together, the forest behind them, a new chapter in both their lives began. One built on hope, trust, and the promise of a brighter future.